Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. And Ginat, I was very glad to hear you say that you're interested in theory because that's where I'm going to go today. And I want to give you a quick introduction of myself first to give you a sense of the perspective that I'm sharing from. So there's my screen. And let me get into full screen mode for you now. Very slow computer today. So I work at the United Nations as an ECOSOC consultant. I'm an interfaith minister, and I've been consulting for over 25 years. I'm an author and speaker, and I have a doctorate in the reinvention of work. I have an insatiable curiosity, and that's really what this is all about today. And I've been in the Amazon jungle, the African bush, throughout Asia, Europe. I've studied many indigenous and spiritual teachers. I've really very interested in this point about applying it to civics and cultural transformation. That's where most of my work is. But and I've been practicing macrobiotics for over 40 years. And I'm trying to figure out how to make these slides progress. There we go. So I just wanted to give you a background. I've been in macrobiotic studies. I did Kushi Institute level 1 and 2, and I did a lot of spiritual seminars with Michio. I traveled with him and Aveline to Japan and Thailand, and spent hours scribing with Michio and learning from him. Studied shiatsu, studied with Aveline and Cornelia Ihara, and so many wonderful, amazing macrobiotic teachers. And we're blessed in the Philadelphia area to have Denny Waxman. We had Geraldine Walker, and all the Waxmans contributed quite a bit. I was really inspired by Michio's One Peaceful World book, and that often gets lost, and I want to recover that today and also combine it with some new breakthroughs in science that I've been working with. And I've been so excited to share this with you because it sent me back into my archives of notes, and I thank you for that cave time because it was just thrilling to revisit and thrilling to have a group that recognizes yin and yang and the energetics. And that's really where I want to take this, is into the energetics of what's going on out there in the world. So my work focuses on global citizenship, on changing to a unity-based paradigm. I do a lot of interdenominational spiritual celebrations. At the end, I'll go ahead and put a link to that celebration in Mount Megiddo, Armageddon, that I was talking about. It's really gorgeous, but I'll do that in the chat at the end. So we've moved. I used to get a few hundred people, and that's still the numbers are pretty small still, but online, we've moved online, and now we're getting up to 10 and 14,000 people at these spiritual celebrations. And the people we're getting, people in the Amazon and shamans and priests and rabbis from inside the old city, and and me, and that it's going around the world sharing prayers, and it's very powerful what's happening now with the moving online. So I was asked here to talk about my book, The Alchemy of Power, which leans a lot on my macrobiotic understandings. I just want to break down a little bit for you because I was so excited to do this, and I think so much of the science that's breaking through now is so confirming of what Michio taught that I actually prepared a different lecture for you. I'm not going to give you my regular book talk, but it's all related, and I wanted to just break down a couple of things here. So power is the ability to cohere or disrupt energy, and that's about it. Right? That's power. So when you break it down to the energetics of yin and yang, it becomes a very powerful way of approaching power. Alchemy is like the difference between two people having the same recipe, but one person's soup tastes better. How come? Right? That's alchemy. There's that extra special something that's more than the sum of parts. We used to think alchemy was turning lead into gold, but that's such a little tiny sliver of misunderstanding. It's mythological of what alchemy is. We actually all are capable of alchemy. We do it every day. The question is our consciousness of it. And leadership, it really comes down to a kind of consciousness. What we know from studies is the person who has done the most self-development, particularly around their values, is the person with the most authority in the room. And that doesn't matter what their rank is. So you could be talking with the CEO and the janitor, but if the janitor is more personally advanced, people are really listening to they might have to pay attention to the CEO. They're listening to the janitor. because that's where people naturally gravitate to. That's what our souls are aligned with. So alchemy is the art of being consciously causal with the metaphysical forces that create disruption and or coherence. That's kind of a basic definition of causality. And that's what we're talking about. Metaphysics is the science of causality. So I start my book with a story. And the story is about, I'm going to move this so you can see everything. The story is, sorry about that, is about that there's a group of well-trained, well-conditioned, well-supplied climbers out of a university with a great team on the ground, prepared for over a year, plenty of funding. They get up to the top of the mountain. There's a yogi sitting there wearing next to nothing. And he says, "What took you so long?" And that's because the yogi, I mean, this is really just a story to start to bring out the yin and the yang, right? All the preparation, all the science, all the data, all that is a very yang way of approaching. The yin way is to go into the consciousness of I can get there and it's all right. So it's kind of simplistic, but this gets us into the field of metaphysics. And metaphysics is the science and the philosophy of causality. It's the science and the philosophy of what causes what. And it's really primal. It is causal. It's primal to anything that happens. And so we have to work in this field more often, more unapologetically and unabashedly. And for many years, you had to kind of secretly whisper this kind of part of the equation. I had to keep a firewall between the work I did as a minister, the work I did as consultant. And now things are beginning to change. There's a shift on the planet that's pretty profound. So this is out of George Osawa's book. It's Michio taught about the cycle of manifestation. So what he says is we start in one infinity. And in the course of, first of all, there's vibration happens or polarization out of one infinity. And that gets us to pre-atomic particles, to elemental particles, into vegetable and animal and humanity. And that's the very pinnacle of being yang, is that manifestation. And then we start to move into yin, which is the expansion, the arising energy, getting up into those invisible, intangible factors of what's going on in the world. So this is how he breaks it down. One infinity is no phenomena, no image, no truth or false. It's just a clean state, no stagnation, no rigidity. And even the word body is a delusional interpretation. So that's so hard to get our minds around. There's not even body. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to go into this today. We so often get lost in the recipes and in our health. And there is so much more to macrobiotics means the great life. And so if we want to really pull into the greatness of it, then we need to start to think about this one infinity and the bigger picture. So from the work I'm doing now around unity and that work, one infinity, all is unity. That's just what's so. And I'm going to tell you a story in a while about a new paradigm, a new narrative that's emerged out of science. And it really puts unity as the truth. Unity is not something, we think it's something, some kind of aspiration we have to keep trying for against all odds, but it is our existential reality. And at the same time, so is duality, because as soon as something comes out of infinity, it's got vibration. If it has vibration, it has up and a down. And if it starts to exist, it has a back and a front. So duality just is so once we exist, once we're into existential world. The difference is the quality of our interpretation. And the paradigm that we're coming out of and the narratives that that's based on are very fear-based. They're very separation-based. And what we're moving into is more of a unity-based paradigm, a unity-based consciousness. The way Michio explained it was that meridians branch down from the consciousness realms, like one infinity and the early vibrational ranges, into manifestation. After 20 years or so old, we grow up, we start to grow our consciousness back up to grow into one infinity. You know, the kid, as we get our careers under our belts, as we get older, you know, see those of us on the screen today, we want to expand. And that's the nature of the human condition, is we want to expand our consciousness. We want to expand our being. And every cell, like this is not so simplistic, right? Every cell is always doing both. It really depends on the clarity of how well it's doing. It depends on how kind of food that you and water and thoughts. The consciousness can impede flow no matter how good you're cooking. If you're cooking out of fear, then you're probably not going to get the benefits no matter how good the food is or how well prepared or consciously prepared it is. It's also the consciousness of the reception. And is it prepared in love? Is it received in love? Makes a huge difference. And this really brings us back to this from one many is the way Michio used to say it. He used to say 1 grain of rice, 10,000 grains of rice, because you plant 1 grain of rice, you eventually can get 10,000 grains. And that's true from one infinity to our reality. He was using that as a metaphor for all of life. So everything beyond that one is interpretation. And once we get beyond infinity and we get these ingoing and outgoing vibrations that are happening on all levels, in all ways, they used to draw these little spirals around the spirals, like everything's happening spiralically all the time. But when we really see from reality, anything we interpret, no matter how clear we are, is still delusion, because the reality is one infinity, is what Michio was teaching. So these are kind of goofy little, this is the yang cycle of spiraling inward, and then the yin cycle of spiraling outward and moving up toward one infinity. So we're talking about one infinity, the cosmic mind, that which cannot be named. And the Taoist said, if you name it, it's not the Tao, right? As soon as we, in our bifurcated, dualistic condition of the human experience on Earth, as soon as we try to describe it, we're off base. But we're never going to stop trying. And as soon as we get as close, when breakthroughs happen, more territory opens up. So it will probably always be the great mystery, but all the more reason to stick with it and try to learn more about it. But yin and yang is really, really important because it captures that pure bifurcation of the unitive. And it helps us transcend a lot of limits in current issues. So certainly around the UN, we have issues around gender, power, economics, all kinds of things. But just taking gender, male, female, you get in this push-pull, this either or. We hear this with vaccinated, unvaccinated. You get into this either or. And that kind of dualistic thinking is really keeps us in that lower stage of consciousness, right? And it's really about how do we open this up. So in terms of gender, we know now that gender fluidity has become such a, in such a short time, it's become such a reality in our world. And if we could look at things more in terms of yin and yang, we could have some insight and we could stop this. It's either gender specific or not, or, male or female, or, we get into this tight kind of against gay, for gay, that kind of fighting really doesn't get us anywhere. And I think yin yang really transcends that. And I found that true in personal, in cultural transformation conversations around the United Nations, that when I can pull out into this, it really helps to dilate the lens of the conversation itself. So I just want to read you a short passage from my book about this. The Taoist philosophical principle of dualism, which is denoted by the concepts of yin and yang, provides a useful model for understanding and affecting the universal constancy of change and for discovering a fuller spectrum of possibilities. Yin-yang philosophy offers us a time-tested framework for exploring the metaphysical realm of causality and for articulating the mysterious powers of change. As an ancient non-theistic philosophy, Taoist teachings on the polarities of yin and yang are especially helpful because the concepts are so metaphysically primal that they carry little cultural or religious baggage. Because yin-yang is gender, values, and deity neutral, it's an uncommonly universal lens, a relatively clear filter for grappling with the unseen elements of power. Using the yin-yang lens provides a metaphysical means for moving beyond emotional charge, personality biases, gender issues, cultural influences, and limited ideations about success. As a tool for examining the forces of change, the dualistic lens of yin and yang offers an elegantly simple key to unlocking complexities. So understanding yin and yang helps us navigate that intangible vibrational pattern that the world flows in. The unseen world flows in, of, around, and through us. That vibrational world that comes directly right after yin yang, right after the one infinity bifurcates. Then these intangible vibrational patterns make us and make the life around us. So creating the great life requires that we pay multidimensional attention. And we sometimes get a little too narrow visioned and pay attention to minutia in our health, which matters and is important, but too often at the expense of what's really at cause, which is consciousness. Consciousness ultimately determines our experience of how we're going to navigate this flow called life. Consciousness is our connection to the infinite. It's an intelligence that lies beyond mind and thought processes. We tend to think of consciousness as mind, but mind is in consciousness, but consciousness is way bigger than that. Without it, we would have no imagination, no creativity, no insight, intuition, or even choice. We can't see it, but without consciousness, there's no seeing. And both science and philosophy tell us that consciousness is a primal generative force in shaping our reality. It's also the interpreter of our reality. So it's both ends. It's kind of an alpha and omega. It's a subtle body of information and a subtle body of energy that we sense from inside of us, but consciousness is not localized in our physical bodies. Consciousness is a subtle body, and that's yin. We experience consciousness as an inner domain of reality, but it's determinant of every outer reality we encounter. So this yin reality is responsible for the yang manifestations. Manifestation is yang, consciousness is yin, and consciousness always comes first. It is primal. Things don't show up without it first having occurred in someone's consciousness. Whether they were conscious of their consciousness or not is another question, but consciousness is root causal. And all social problems are first and foremost a crisis of consciousness, and we ignore consciousness at our own risk. And this crisis of consciousness is so critical. And this is what the work where I'm really focusing now at the UN is to say that we want to put consciousness in the conversation. We want to open up the domain of consciousness as a working domain so that when we work on the UN agendas, we actually work on what's the consciousness needed to accomplish this agenda. Because if projects alone were enough, we'd be there. That's a very young approach. I'll just do one more project and feed the homeless or the hungry. And those are all good things. But they don't get us there because we're not working enough in the yin. We're doing so much yang work and we're so yang biased that we forget that equilibrium is both. So what is consciousness? One of the people that I work with has worked the most, Richard Barrett, he does values work, quantifying cultures by measuring values. And values are the link between the intangible and the tangible. So they're very powerful. And we could do a whole talk on that. That's actually my area of expertise is values-driven leadership and cultural development. But Richard says it's about equilibrium. And that's what macrobiotics is really about. It's a way of creating a multi-dimensional equanimity. It's not just physical. And especially Michio and the teachers in the West kind of took a left turn when they saw that most people interested in macrobiotics in the early days were either people were really seeking big consciousness. And so they were coming from a lot of drugs. So they were very yinned out. And a lot of the cancers they were dealing with were yin cancers. And so a lot of the answers were yang answers. And this is just a good way of looking at the difference here. So the metaphysical is like 95% of the iceberg is below the surface. And that's where the metaphysical is. And what happens, the projects, the structures, the manifestations are yang. They happen, on the surface. And now, I'm using this in simplistic ways. Of course, there's a yin circle in the yang part of the symbol, and there's a yang circle in the yin part of the symbol. And that's because these are never absolute. That's one of the beauties of using yin and yang. They're always relative. And they always are not absolute. And that's really important to keep in mind. So this is the UN's agenda until 2030. You may have seen these. These are, the whole world has agreed on this, so that's huge. And in a way, it was very good because the UN was kind of yin. It was, had this big world peace, but how do you break it down? So they got more yang. They broke it down into a 17-item to-do list for the world, and they're called the Sustainable Development Goals. And so a few years into this, as I was working with it, I started to say, folks, the work is in the white space in between these goals, and the work is in the saturation of the color and what is between, among, around, and through these goals, which is exactly what we're talking about today, the consciousness. But what we're fighting against is what I call the fluffy myth in my book, and that's the belief that intangible factors like consciousness and things like that are inconsequential, fluffy stuff, and only things like figures and tangible outcomes are real. And that's a very yang dominant assumption, which most of our evaluations have been for millennia. We've been mostly male led in our religions and our politics in most of the industrialized world for millennia. And we tend to have our economics and social structures. Militarism gets the highest amount of money mostly. We have a lot of politically driven suffering. And there's a lot of numbers driven data that's considered truth. And on the other side of that, there's where Michi always said, where there's a front, there's a back. This is actually George Osawa's principles. And where there's a big front, there's a big back. The big front is we've had amazing strides in who we are as a species, scientifically, communications wide. I mean, look, we can have spiritual ceremony with people on every continent, and even deep into the jungle. But our underlying cultural narrative really rests in this fluff mythology. And there's a really deep disregard for yin. And we saw it so much in the early days of macrobiotics. There were a lot of very hard gender expectations. Women were in the kitchen and men did everything else. And there was a lot of that in the Japanese culture that got handed down, and the times were not as liberated as they are now. But now on one of the two vaccine calls, Denny talked about one of the two mistakes they made was not having enough fruit. And I went, yes, it is really about that people were eating for dessert. They were eating rice cakes with miso spread on them, and they were considering that dessert. So we had tight. There was a lot of judgmentalism and gossip and things like that. And some people who were eating the best were the most yellow and the most rigid and the most difficult to have a joyful moment with. And so now macrobiotics, like everything else, is yinning out. And that's a lot of the point of my book. So the fluffy theory that we all were acculturated with, we swim in the water of believing. I've written a book about it, I speak about it, and I still cannot tell you that I have resolved this in my own world. But it is a fear-based mythology, and it reflects yang dominant norms. And because there are norms, we very rarely stop and really look and say, is this really how we want to live our lives? But the world is evolving yinward. I think in the great pendulum of time, we've been so far in the yang domain, it's been pretty hard to even know where how far yin, the middle point really is. But if we want to get to the great life, I believe we need to evolve in a more yinward way. Macrobiotics certainly has done that over the years, and I believe the culture at large is trying to do that. And that reflects the human spirit's unrelenting urge to expand, just like that tree after 20 years old goes back to expansion. So what I say is that the receding culture has yang-itis. And that's like an inflammation of yang. It's yang so much that it's causing disease. Our valuations are yang dominant valuations, and yin is unvalued, undervalued, and often devalued. How often have you heard that this is just, when you talk about the energetics of food, you are almost looked at like you have a mental deficiency or something. You know, there's really, it's bad enough that it's undervalued or unvalued, but devaluation is where the real pain and suffering comes from, is that everything that we know intuitively inside ourselves, that is the human spirit's deep existential urge, is said, oh no, that's not real. It's only real that they have enough money to pay the rent. Well, you know, that doesn't work, but we have been acculturated these beliefs about reality for a long time. And I want to read you a quick paragraph that I wrote about that in the book. Most of us are acculturated to a long-standing ontology, an accepted ground of being. Ontology means our very ground of being, that dismisses yin-leaning activities as weak and yin-replenishing activities as unimportant. Our natural sense of what equanimity is has probably been corrupted by cultural norms for yang dominance. We have been so acculturated to believe that leaning yangward is best, and systems are so yang-oriented that we can often be unaware of just how much yinning out we might need to do. Think of it in terms of an electrical charge. No one would ever advocate for having just one polarity come through the outlet, or even mostly one polarity. And that's exactly what we do when we allow unrelenting yang influences to overpower the yin. So this comes down to narratives, and this is something I really am excited to get into you about, because I'm working on this new paradigm, this new narrative. The old paradigm we're coming out of, and paradigm means not just fixing what's going wrong with things, but actually setting a new set point. Our set point has been very much around separation values, right? We're good, bad, we're Republican, Democrat, we're vaccinated, not vaccinated, we're, you know, so we come into this, we're separated from God, and our work is to get back to it, is a lot of the new teachings newer teachings in religions, where they're really old. If you go into the mystical original teachings, they're much more coherent with the new paradigm, which is unity and love based, and has more equanimity for yin and yang. We may need to yin out too much to find where the middle point is in terms of that grand pendulum of time. We may have to swing a little too far to the yin to find out where the actual correction, you know, how to correct this idea of where the center is. That is, in my theory, just way, way, way into the yang domain and not center at all. So I'm going to leave this slide up while I tell you this story about the unitive narrative. This is based on work I've been doing with a cosmologist named Jude Currivan and some other evolutionary leaders whose names you may or may not recognize, but some real amazing global thinkers. So here's the emerging more unitive narrative in a nutshell. 13.8 billion years ago, not in a big bang, but in an incredibly fine-tuned first moment of an ongoing big breath. And that breath of universal consciousness continues to manifest as ever more complex mathematical signatures and processes of wholeness that are being found at all scales of existence and through many different fields of study. The recent discovery of the holographic nature of how the big breath is unfolding requires us to do a retake on reality, because now it's clear that our wholeness is not within our own skin, but with the entirety of all that is. From pre-particle to atoms, to people, to planets, to groups of galaxies and beyond, we are indivisible from it all. And our retake on reality is happening across many scientific fields, from cosmology, which is a field of physics that this information that I just gave you and more that I'm going to tell you is coming out of now. Quantum physics is saying this. There are things happening in chemistry and biology and behavioral and neurosciences, in complexity science especially. And they concur that our evolutionary purpose is inseparable from each other and inseparable from the entirety of all that we can comprehend and beyond what we can comprehend. And this goes right back to what Michio was saying. that we are interdependently co-arising with Gaia herself. Now, Gaia is the understanding that the whole earth is a system, that all beings in the earth itself is one organism that regulates itself as one whole being. And now that concept is being extended to include the entire universe, not just the earth. And since that big breath, almost 14 billion years ago, a sentient and a conscious universe continues to emerge. And it moves from simplicity to complexity and diversity, from yin to yang, to wave to ocean, and back again. It's a movement and a rest, a movement and a rest, and back and forth and back and forth. And science is telling us that the universe itself is in a process of ever-growing self-awareness. And as we humans become more and more conscious of our interdependence and our interbeing with one another, that consciousness in the whole universe grows. And the more conscious that we are of our evolutionary microcosmic co-creativity with that great mystery, with the source of all being, with that one infinite cosmic mind, that's really where we need to bring our consciousness to understand our power in the universe. And what's unfolding from this, and I don't want to get ahead of my skis here because I'm reaching my own limitations of understanding, but we are a fractal of a universal sentience that is unfolding in, of, and through each of us and among the whole in creation and beyond. So this idea that we are a fractal really is an interesting way of seeing how what happens at that one infinite to the bifurcation moment that Michio taught about. So really, cosmologists are telling us now what a lot of people already intuited. Obviously, Michio was there a long time ago, and many others have been too, especially many spiritual teachers, that we are an unfolding, unlimited part of the whole of not just Gaia, but of the whole universe of the infinite cosmic mind. And it's not just cosmology that's telling us this. Now, evolutionary biologists are even redefining Darwin's idea of what survival of the fittest means. What they're recognizing now, and it actually is coherent with Darwin from what I'm told, is that competition, which is what we have always, because we had that narrative, so survival of the fittest fit right into our narrative that competition is how you survive. And it's just not true. After you get past very, very singular celled organisms and you get into multicellular organisms, survival of the fittest is only true if you include capacity for collaboration and how you define fitness. In other words, nothing can be thought of as fit if it doesn't accommodate the reality of our fundamental and existential unity. So this is now, these discoveries in science and people coming to the realization, many of us, I'm sure many on this call, have had this inkling that this ain't it. The way we've been indoctrinated, acculturated, the water we swim in, is something's got to give here. Something needs to be different. And so they kind of are demanding that we reshape our fundamental narrative to be more coherent with the science, that it isn't a separation, competition-based reality that we live in. And we need to really establish new fundamentals, and that's what a cultural narrative is. It's different than a story. Story is more superficial. The narrative is usually not told, but it's that underlying cultural story that we all kind of unconsciously agree with. And so now we have these new fundamentals that are supporting us in moving from Shark Tank consciousness to unity consciousness. And I'll read you just a quick passage from the unity narrative, and I can get you can see maybe the link to that. Oops, sorry. The link to that. Oh no, screwing up my slides. So as space expands from its minuscule birth and time flows from past to present to future, life embodies a profound evolutionary impulse, driven not by random occurrences and mutations, but through resonant and harmonic interplays of forces and influences that are meaningfully and coherently informed and guided. That informed has a dash in it, informed. Whatever is coming from infinity forms us from within. Gaia's continuing emergence is embodied in collaborative and synergistic relationships and in dynamic co-evolutionary partnerships on a planetary scale, where now the cultural evolution of humanity may be realized as an integral part of our own planet's own evolutionary progress and purpose. That's the end of the quote. So what it's saying is that we are all integral with the whole planet's evolution and with the infinite great spirit itself, that not only breathed that initial breath of creation, but that also is that breath. And the new narrative sets us up to better attune to the resonance and the harmonics of the source that informs and guides us. We're not only one unified whole with the earth and all beings. We are one unified whole with the great creator that some call God, that Micho called one infinity, and that we will never be able to fully name. And that's why unity is taught in all the mystical traditions. It's taught, the Upanishads were Hindu and taught a lot of the early Christians. They're all about unity. The Quran says there's no fissure in existence. The Christian God is of oneness. The Jewish Torah says the reality is one. And of course, our indigenous teachers have always taught we're one with the planet, and the planet itself is sentient. They call it the rock people, the fish people, the air people, because they recognize the sentience in the universe. So how do we access this? How do we really go into this level of consciousness? What do we do with this? What do we do with this? Well, I'd like to go back to what Einstein said. He said, human beings, vegetables, or cosmic dust. We all dance to a mysterious tune intoned in the distance by an invisible piper. And that invisible piper is kind of what I'm trying to get at today. And this has been my life's journey, why I've trekked the earth and studied so much and worked so hard at this, is that, I'm really like, what is this thing that pipes through us? I think it was Hafiz or Rumi said, God, we are like flutes that God plays through. So that this is the understandings of the mystics. So how do you navigate this intangible and the tangible? Well, it's just like electricity. You wouldn't want part of a spark, and you need that equanimity. And this is what's so important, the word equanimity, not balance. If you breathe in, you're more yin. If you breathe out, you're more yang. So you don't want balance, because if you stopped at either one of those, right in between them at the perfect place, you'd have to die. So to stay there. So, life is about the changing between yin and yang. That's what the whole I Ching is about. So if you want the best equanimity, you want to have the best quality yin, the best quality yang in a good balance that's appropriate for the moment. There are times you want to be very yang to do what needs to be done. There are times you want to be more yin. But when those two things come together, it's just like electricity in the wall, and they spark. And I call that spark mojo. And I would say that's mostly what my book is about, is mojo. And mojo is that energy, that vitality, that zip, zing, pizzazz, that thing that makes the difference between being able to put all the elements of a carrot in a lab dish and being able to make a carrot. We can't do that because we don't have the metaphysical understanding yet to spark that spark of life. Tagore, who was a Hindu mystic, called it the life throb of ages dancing through our blood. And to me, that's where the juice is. That's why you want to eat well, because you want to make that vehicle a really good vehicle for lots of mojo to be stirring up and pulsing around in. And how do we access this? How do we get into these other realms of consciousness? I think a really simple and direct way is to ask yourself, how's my mojo? And to take it out, part of the old paradigm coming to this new realization was people started to take more conscious inventory of themselves. And that's been a good thing. Anything's got a front and a back. And the back is that is we have a lot of narcissism showing up in the guise of expansiveness. And so looking around saying, how's everybody else's mojo in the room? Tuning into that, learning to attune ourselves to what's going on in the room. How's the energy in the room? So I'm using this as a word for energy, but meaning it a little more specifically than just the word energy. It is specifically, how's the juice in the room? How's the mojo? And it's really important to stoke your mojo. what's it take to me, meditation. I was so glad to see the meditation presentation today, because that is certainly a huge part. To me, that's as important and more important than eating. It's as important as brushing your teeth. Make some time to get into that place, because that's critical. You can't source mojo by money, fame, success, poverty, or suffering. And there's a lot in the Christian tradition and in the Buddhist tradition around really raising up the glory of suffering. And folks, I really don't think that's it. I think that's part of that mythology, that youngitis. Joy, we're here to be in joy. We're here to love. And suffering is going to happen. The question is, what are we growing? What is our consciousness making room for? How do we walk in equanimity, whether there's suffering, poverty, joy? You want that equanimity to be in strength, no matter what's happening around you. So for me, that's really keeping the mojo flowing. And you can't source it by these things, although without these things, it's harder to think about mojo if you've got a child starving, or if an oil company just cut down your hut and you have no place to sleep that night. Which is the kind of issues we see around the UN. So these conversations we're having are luxury conversations. And because we have the luxury of having them, it is our duty to go into here and go ahead and go into this realm that is a little harder to get our arms around, harder to express out there in the world, harder to make and claim the space to stoke your mojo and to source it. And harder to decide that we are consciously managing. So a couple of distinctions I want to leave you with is mojo flows the way that love goes, and mojo flows in accordance with consciousness. And really the basis of my book is that mojo matters, and that these metaphysical things matter, that these invisible factors are indeed factors, and there are more causal, as you saw in the slide. There are much more causal than, you do a project and things change for the person with the project, but you change the consciousness of the community, and that project falls on way more fertile ground, and transformation may come out of the project. Not just some mouths were fed, feeding mouths is good, but in a lot of what I've seen in all my work in social development over the years is that there is this just this real misunderstanding around that, and what I hope to bring out is this greater consciousness that this is the domain we need to put some attention in. And I want to finish up this. We are the dawn of a new fire. It's a new paradigm. There was a Christian mystic in the early 1900s, and his name was Teilhard de Chardin. And he said, someday, after mastering the winds, the waves, the tides, and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And then, for a second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire. And I do believe that's where we are. We have already, I believe, crossed into new paradigm, and there may be a lot of falling apart that needs to happen. There may be a lot of, young cracks. That's part of what happens when things get so tight, it can crack and fall apart. And so that's going to happen. And all the more reason why we need to find our equanimity by eating well and living well and living the great life, a life where joy is part of the equation, not just miso. We really have to expand our understanding of what well-being is and step into this dawn of a new fire in full loving consciousness and presence. And so with that, I will stop sharing. And I see that some chats have come in, but I could not see them while I did this. Yes, Joni, so talking about changeover from number 9 to 8 coming in 20. That may be so. I have not been keeping up with 9-star key, but what we're seeing is that this unitive narrative is coherent, and that's the problem. Our old narrative was completely incoherent with most of our spiritual teachings, and incoherent with science, as it turns out, although we believe that that's all science, but it's old Newtonian science. It's not holding up anymore. to rise together. That's right. Competition is to rise. Well, I kind of, Carol, I might want to go back and forth with you on that. We don't have time, but I get your point. Unity-based concept is handy. It's more than handy, it's true, and it's what macrobiotics came out of, is that we are one. Inventory the nine. Yes, we are saying goodbye, and it may not say fully goodbye in our generation or even the next 1 or 2 generations. Paradigm change is not like one day you're in one, and it's not a switch you flip. It's a pendulum swinging through time. But I do believe we've made the shift. We were working toward the shift for a long time. COVID really pushed that pendulum a little faster. And I believe really in the last 6 months or so that we've actually crossed. Only history will tell. Only history will tell. Yes, thank you. Thank you, CMEC. I am located near Philadelphia. And thank you for the commenting on beauty. So we have a little bit of time. If anyone wants to dialogue a little bit about this, I'd love to do that.
I have 3 questions or comments. The first one is that you spoke about the big breath at the beginning. So my question is then, indeed, there was a beginning as opposed to not. And if correlated with that, if there's a beginning, then there's an end. So let me ask all 3 because I'll forget.
Let me answer that so I don't, you'll forget, I'll forget too. So let me write down what you're asking. Okay.
No, never mind. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So Michio taught about the beginningless beginning.
Okay.
And that's what we're talking about. And so what Jude was doing in her work as a cosmologist was saying, Big Bang is like so violent. It's a young dominant way of thinking about the beginning of the universe. Banged. Well, she's saying, no, the reality is it probably breathed. Well, if it was a great out breath somewhere, there was an in breath, right? So there's this, that's why this is a never ending conversation. We'll never get there in the human condition because we can only see it from our bifurcated lens of dualism because we are on the planet. And so there's, it's an answerless question, I guess, in some ways.
Well, my second question is similar. You mentioned kind of in passing, perhaps that there is a past, present, and future. And I'm interested in the concept of time rather than linear. Are there different paradigms for time?
Yes. And time is really, it's first of all, it's an artificial construct. Right. So it's something humanity uses for convenience. It is a pretty young construct. And it is hard for yin to find its way sometimes in the construct of strong time orientation. And a lot of what is being said in the readings I do is everything's happening all at once. It's all simultaneous. Okay. And time and our consciousness, one infinity, that's what that's all about. And as we start to interpret it, which as Michio says, is always going to be wrong. But as we start to try to grapple with that, then we start to chunk it out into hours and it's our way of trying to manage and understand. And, my point is there are other ways too that are timeless. And that, it's stepping out of that paradigm of time sometimes, just going on a retreat, as he was talking about people leaving their phones, just sitting in a room and going into that timeless space, that alone can be world changing.
So we have beginningless beginning and timeless time.
Right.
And my last question was about this concept of a new fire, something at the very end. And I'm wondering about fire, that fire is very young, that you might have switched the change to water or to air or something more yin.
Well, I think it was Max Planck. He was a physicist or mathematician who won a Nobel Prize, and he said, no model is accurate, but some are helpful. And so all of this is given in that spirit, that this is not truth, it's a way of looking. I
So
think
the
it was
model
Bill
was,
Tara. Bill Tara wrote the Magic Glasses, right? It's a way of looking. It's a lens to look through. And so, tell me your question again. I want to make sure I'm.
no, I think you did well. That was fine.
So let me take Grace's. Hi, Grace, my dear friend. You brought to light the concept of the importance of organisms working together in order to evolve as opposed to survival of the fittest. This is true even in the plant world. Could you elaborate and also bring to light the destructiveness of bifurcation? Yeah, I mean, bifurcation, once you have bifurcation, you're going to have life and death. You're going to have, growing and not growing. It's like we're going to get that just by virtue of the fact that we're not in that one infinity, as soon as we're out of there. And that's the beauty. I mean, we see the delineation between air and trees and flowers and birds, I mean, that's the beauty of this precious life on earth. But this idea of, I'll give you an example, not just in the plant world where roots, if dandelions, they will change the soil around them as the seeds come toward them to make the seed plant better. Sperm and eggs, we always have the story in our old paradigm that the sperm all fight each other to get to the egg, right? That it's a big war in there. The truth is, all the other sperm do something that there's some kind of chemical that softens the outer layer of the egg so that the one sperm or two can actually penetrate that. So it is a collaborative, even that is a collaborative. And we find that once something gets past single cellular, that's really that's their key to survival, is how much they're cooperating. Even though it may not be cooperation quite as we think about it, but we are going from big yang to big yin, and we are at the new beginning, and part of that is realizing this interdependency. We are interdependently co-arising with everything and everyone, and so is everything else. And to Grace's point, the roots underneath the ground are cooperative in how they're bringing nutrients to one another, and how they're moving aside for one to get through, or they weave together, right? There's really all kinds of things at every level of our existence going on like that. It is a cooperative universe, or we would not be here. We know now that it's not possible without that. And yet we still have this young dominance, young-itis, that teaches us if we just fight harder, we'll win. If we just get more guns, that's the way to peace. These are all young-itis. These are diseased ideas. Peace is the way to peace. War has never, ever worked as the way to peace. Peace is the way to peace. And so moving into this domain, this yin domain, yin for yin's sake. And it really does mean standing some ground. I've stood some pretty uncomfortable ground over time. And I was much more careful. And I think the really big news is that people are getting it. Like even some pretty hardcore people at the UN who aren't going to come to a lecture like this, and I wouldn't put this content there necessarily, but they're recognizing that all these fabulous people doing fabulous projects and good work will not get us there. The Sustainable Development Goals cannot be accomplished by accomplishing one goal. They either all get accomplished or none are going to be accomplished. We're recognizing the interdependence of all these things. We're recognizing our co-creativity. Just like the roots in the ground, we are those roots too with one another. And so how are we enabling one another to flourish? How are we putting love in the space? And this is where macrobiotics got into so much trouble so early on. I think people stayed sicker a lot of times and got more yellow and skinnier and drier because, and they were gossiping, all that stuff was happening because there was this belief, if I just get tight enough, if I just get young enough, I'll be good, because that's what our whole paradigm said. It wasn't their fault. It was a natural expression, and macrobiotics was as much part of it as anything. Way ahead in so many ways because, so many of the teachers were putting these distinctions out, but without this deeper underlying change. But now when I bring these things up, at the UN or other places where there are, crowds that may or may not be as friendly toward these ideas, I'm seeing more relief than anything, honestly. There are more people thinking this way because we have made this shift. And so more people are resonating. They may not be thinking this way, but they're resonating. And so that when they hear it, they get it. And they're saying, oh yeah, and they're relieved. And some of them are thinking this way, and they were afraid to say it because, you could lose your career track. We were working, when I first started at the UN, we were working with very high level leaders, and we had them in tears sometimes. We were working on, it was called Visionary Leadership. And we did a series over several years. And we often had very high level people in tears because they came to the UN to serve humanity. And they couldn't get there from there. There was something in their hearts that was resonating with the Charter and the Declaration of Human Rights and all the good stuff. And yet there was this other stuff going on, and they couldn't figure out the breakthrough. And now the breakthrough has sort of happened in the culture. They could lose their place in their career track if they were talking about this on the wrong elevator. So now that's just not true. There's an office of transformation in the UN. These words are hitting. I'm inputting on really high level documents and in high level processes. We just did a big thing on this unitive narrative for the high level political forum, which is how the UN manages its agenda every year. It's really well received because people are recognizing there's just got to be another level we can work from. There's got to be, more that we can, and they're talking about consciousness. And so it's really in some ways a new frontier. It's our most ancient and only frontier in so many other ways. But I encourage you to go there with all the mojo you got. Stoke it.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much, everyone.